The photograph sits in my hands, edges worn and yellowed with age. 5 children smiling at the camera on what appears to be an ordinary summer day in 1934. I found it while clearing out my grandmother's attic in Oakwood Hills last month, tucked inside an old leather-bound album with a curious note scrawled on the back. 5 smiled, 4 were there, August 12, 1934. My name is Daniel Harmon, and this discovery has led me down a path I never expected to travel. What you're about to hear is the story I've pieced together about this photograph and the children of Oakwood Hills, a small town that harbored secrets beneath its peaceful exterior. The summer of 1934 was particularly warm in Oakwood Hills. While the Great Depression had hit many communities hard, this small town nestled between rolling hills and dense forests had managed to maintain some semblance of normalcy. Children still played in the streets, families gathered for Sunday picnics by the lake, and Mr. Peterson still ran the general store where penny candy was displayed in glass jars on the counter. Among the children of Oakwood Hills were 5 who had formed an inseparable bond: Thomas Miller, Elizabeth Lizzie Caldwell, Robert Bobby Jenkins, Margaret Maggie Sullivan, and James Jimmy Wallace. They were all around 10 years old that summer, navigating the threshold between childhood innocence and the growing awareness of the complicated world around them. Thomas was the unofficial leader of the group, tall for his age, with a mop of brown hair that never seemed to stay combed despite his mother's best efforts. His father owned the local newspaper, which afforded Thomas access to stories and information other children weren't privy to. Lizzie was the most academically gifted, always carrying a book wherever she went. Her round, wire-framed glasses would slide down her nose as she read, and she'd absent-mindedly push them back up without taking her eyes off the page. Her father was the town doctor, and she had grown up learning medical terms that impressed even adults. Bobby was the athlete, fast on his feet and skilled with a baseball. His father had been a semi-professional player before the crash of '29 forced him to take work at the factory outside of town. Bobby practiced relentlessly, hoping that someday he might fulfill the dreams his father had been forced to abandon. Maggie was known for her imagination and storytelling abilities. With her red hair and pigtails, she would enthrall the others with tales she'd invented, some so detailed and vivid that even the adults would stop to listen. Her father worked as the town's telegraph operator, which meant Maggie was often the first to hear news from the outside world. And then there was Jimmy Wallace. Quiet and observant, Jimmy was the son of the town's only photographer, Harold Wallace, who ran a small studio on Main Street. Jimmy had inherited his father's eye for detail and spent much of his time learning about cameras and developing photographs in his father's darkroom. The 5 of them were inseparable that summer, exploring the woods, building a fort by the creek, and sharing secrets that only children can understand. They called themselves the Firefly 5, a name inspired by their evening adventures catching the glowing insects in mason jars, watching them illuminate the darkness before releasing them back into the night. What makes this photograph so unsettling is what I discovered when I visited Oakwood Hills 2 weeks ago. The town library keeps detailed records and old newspapers, and the librarian, a woman in her 70s named Mrs. Fletcher, recognized the names when I mentioned them. "Oh, those poor children," she had said, her eyes clouding with a distant memory. Such a tragedy. According to the Oakwood Hills Gazette dated August 10, 1934, 2 days before the date written on the photograph, Jimmy Wallace had gone missing. I'm looking at a copy of that newspaper now. The headline reads, "Local boy missing, search continues." The article describes how Jimmy Wallace, age 10, had last been seen on the afternoon of August 7th, heading toward the woods with his friends. When he didn't return home for supper, his parents alerted the town sheriff. By the following morning, a search party had been organized. The article quotes Sheriff Davis, "We have reason to believe the boy may have wandered too far into the woods. We're concentrating our search efforts around Blackwater Creek, where the children often play." Jimmy's father, Harold Wallace, was also quoted, "Jimmy knows those woods. He wouldn't just get lost. Something must have happened to my boy." The 4 other children, Thomas, Lizzie, Bobby, and Maggie, were questioned by the sheriff. According to follow-up articles, they all told the same story. They had been playing at their fort by the creek when Jimmy said he wanted to go home to help his father in the darkroom. They watched him leave, heading down the path toward town. That was the last time they saw him. For 3 days, the town searched. Men with lanterns combed the woods at night. Neighboring communities sent volunteers. The creek was dragged multiple times. But Jimmy Wallace had vanished without a trace. And yet, here in this photograph dated August 12th, 5 days after Jimmy disappeared, 5 children smile at the camera: Thomas, Lizzie, Bobby, Maggie, and Jimmy. During my visit to Oakwood Hills, I was fortunate enough to meet Eleanor Sullivan, Maggie's younger sister, now in her 90s. Sharp-minded and clear-eyed, Eleanor invited me into her home when I mentioned I was researching the events of that summer. "I was only 6 that year," Eleanor told me, her hands clasped in her lap as she sat in a worn armchair. "But some things you don't forget, no matter how many years pass." According to Eleanor, the day after Jimmy disappeared, the other 4 children began acting strangely. They would whisper among themselves and fall silent whenever adults approached. They stopped playing with other children and spent hours alone in Thomas's basement. "My sister wouldn't tell me what they were doing," Eleanor said, "but I heard her crying at night. She kept saying, 'We didn't mean to. We didn't mean to.' Mother thought she was just upset about Jimmy." On August 11th, Harold Wallace received an anonymous note claiming to have information about Jimmy's whereabouts. The note directed him to bring his camera to the old oak tree by Blackwater Creek at noon the following day, August 12th. Desperate for any lead, Harold informed Sheriff Davis, who agreed to accompany him. When they arrived at the specified location, they found Thomas, Lizzie, Bobby, and Maggie waiting there. "Mr. Wallace," Thomas had said, according to Eleanor's recollection of her sister's account, "Jimmy wants you to take our picture." Harold Wallace was initially angry, believing the children were playing a cruel prank, but the 4 insisted that Jimmy was there with them, standing in the middle of their group. Sheriff Davis began to question the children more sternly, but Harold, perhaps out of desperation or some faint hope, decided to humor them. "Fine," he reportedly said. "Stand together and I'll take your picture." The children arranged themselves in a line by the oak tree, Thomas on the far left, then Lizzie, then a space in the middle where they claimed Jimmy was standing, then Maggie, and Bobby on the far right. Harold looked through his viewfinder, seeing only 4 solemn-faced children. "Smile," he instructed, his voice breaking, and they did. Later that day, Harold developed the photograph in his darkroom. What emerged on the paper during the developing process defied explanation. 5 children stood by the oak tree, all smiling at the camera, and in the middle, clear as day, was Jimmy. Word spread quickly through the small town. Some called it a miracle, others a hoax. Sheriff Davis confiscated the photograph as evidence, and the children were separated and questioned again, this time more intensively. Under the pressure of interrogation, their unified story began to crack. 3 days after the photograph was taken, Bobby Jenkins broke down and told Sheriff Davis what had happened. The story that emerged was both tragic and ordinary, the kind of accident that can change lives in an instant. On August 7th, the 5 children had indeed been playing at their fort by Blackwater Creek. They had been engaged in a game of dares, and Jimmy, always eager to prove himself to the others, had accepted the challenge to walk across the creek on a fallen log that spanned its width. The creek was swollen from recent rains, the current stronger than usual. Jimmy had made it halfway across when he lost his balance. The others watched in horror as he fell into the rushing water. Thomas and Bobby had immediately run along the bank, trying to reach Jimmy as he was swept downstream. Lizzie and Maggie ran to get help, but by the time adults arrived, there was no sign of Jimmy. Terrified of the consequences, the 4 children concocted a story about Jimmy leaving to go home. They convinced themselves that if no one knew they were responsible, they wouldn't get in trouble. It was the desperate logic of frightened children. Following Bobby's confession, a more focused search was conducted downstream. Jimmy's body was found 2 miles away, caught in a collection of branches and debris. The official cause of death was drowning. The 4 children were not charged with any crime, as authorities ruled it a tragic accident compounded by the poor judgment of scared children. But the guilt they carried would shape the rest of their lives. Harold Wallace and his wife left Oakwood Hills soon after Jimmy's funeral. The photography studio closed, the building eventually becoming a hardware store. The Wallace name faded from the town's memory, surviving only in records and the whispered stories of the unusual photograph. But what about the photograph? How does one explain the clear image of Jimmy standing among his friends, days after his death? The official explanation, as recorded in Sheriff Davis's final report, was that Harold Wallace had used a technique called spirit photography, a double exposure method that had been popular in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. The sheriff concluded that Harold had combined a previous photograph of Jimmy with the new image of the 4 children, creating the illusion that all 5 were present. Spirit photography had been used by charlatans to convince grieving families that they could capture images of their deceased loved ones. The sheriff's theory was that Harold, in his grief, had created the composite image either as a form of denial or as an act of vengeance against the children he held responsible for his son's death. Case closed. A rational explanation for an irrational time. Except, I'm not convinced. During my research, I discovered that Thomas Miller, who had grown up to become a professor of physics at a prestigious university, had given an interview to a local newspaper in 1984, 50 years after the incident. By then, he was the only one of the four still living. In the interview, he addressed the photograph directly. Science can explain many things, but not everything. What happened that day by the oak tree exists in the space between what we know and what we don't. All I can say with certainty is that when Mr. Wallace took our picture, we felt Jimmy there with us. And apparently, so did the camera. My investigation took an even stranger turn when I tracked down the original photograph through county records. It had been stored as evidence and later transferred to the County Historical Society. The curator there allowed me to examine it under supervision. The first thing I noticed was that there were no signs of manipulation, no cutting or pasting, no obvious double exposure techniques. Photography experts I've consulted since then have confirmed this assessment. If Harold Wallace created a composite image, he did so with a level of skill that would have been remarkable for that era. But there's something else. A detail I only noticed when studying the photograph under magnification. In the background, partially hidden by the branches of the oak tree, there appears to be a sixth figure. It's blurry and indistinct, but it seems to be watching the children from a distance. I returned to Oakwood Hills one final time to visit the location where the photograph was taken. The old oak tree still stands by Blackwater Creek, though the area around it has changed considerably over the decades. As I stood there trying to imagine the scene from that August day in 1934, an elderly man approached me. He introduced himself as William Davis, the grandson of Sheriff Davis who had investigated the case. My grandfather never believed the spirit photography explanation, William told me as we stood by the creek. He included it in his report because he needed to close the case, but privately he had a different theory. According to William, his grandfather had noticed something peculiar during the investigation. In the days between Jimmy's disappearance and the taking of the photograph, multiple residents of Oakwood Hills reported seeing Jimmy around town, walking down Main Street, sitting on the steps of the library, standing outside his father's studio. These sightings were dismissed as the product of a town's collective hope and grief, but Sheriff Davis had documented them meticulously in his personal journal, which William had inherited. My grandfather came to believe that Jimmy's presence lingered in Oakwood Hills for those 5 days, William said. Not as a ghost in the traditional sense, but as something else, something between memory and reality. The final entry in Sheriff Davis's journal about the case reads, "Some things cannot be explained through conventional means." What the camera captured that day was not a trick of photography, but a moment when the veil between worlds thinned. I have no explanation that would satisfy the rational mind, but I know what the children told me. Jimmy was there with them, one last time, to say goodbye. In the 9 decades since that photograph was taken, there have been numerous theories about what really happened. Some suggest mass hysteria or collective hallucination. Others point to psychological trauma, causing the children to genuinely believe their friend was present. Still others embrace supernatural explanations, that Jimmy's spirit returned to absolve his friends of their guilt or to complete unfinished business. The 4 surviving children went on to lead full lives, though according to town records and family accounts, none of them ever fully escaped the shadow of what happened that summer. They remained connected throughout their lives, meeting annually on August 12th at the old oak tree, a tradition they maintained until Thomas, the last survivor, passed away in 1989. Lizzie became a nurse during World War II and died of tuberculosis in 1943. Bobby joined the Army and was killed in action in Korea in 1951. Maggie married, had children, and became a teacher in Oakwood Hills, passing away from cancer in 1978. Thomas pursued his academic career with singular focus, becoming a respected physicist known for his work on the nature of light and its interaction with matter. And what of the mysterious 6th figure in the background of the photograph? Historical records show that Harold Wallace had an older brother who died in World War I. In the few surviving photographs of him, there's a striking resemblance to the blurry figure watching from the trees. Some locals believe that it was not just Jimmy who appeared that day, but Harold's brother as well, coming to guide Jimmy to whatever lies beyond our understanding. As I wrap up this investigation, I'm left with more questions than answers. The photograph sits on my desk as I record this. 5 children smiling at the camera on what appears to be an ordinary summer day in 1934. 5 children, when only 4 were physically present. The note on the back, written in what I've confirmed was Harold Wallace's handwriting, remains the most succinct summary of the inexplicable. 5 smiled. 4 were there. August 12th, 1934. Perhaps some mysteries aren't meant to be solved but experienced. Reminders that the world is stranger and more wondrous than we often allow ourselves to believe. The children of Oakwood Hills would be well over 100 years old now if any had survived to the present day. Their story might have been forgotten entirely if not for this peculiar photograph and the questions it continues to raise. Before I conclude, there's one final detail that gives me pause. When I was examining the original photograph at the Historical Society, I noticed something I hadn't seen in the reproduction my grandmother had kept. On the back of the photograph, beneath Harold Wallace's note, is another line written in a child's unsteady hand. "I forgive you, J.W." According to the curator, this additional writing wasn't present when the photograph was initially cataloged. It appeared sometime in the 1980s, during the brief period when the photograph was on display as part of an exhibition on local history. So what really happened in Oakwood Hills during that summer of 1934? Was the photograph a carefully crafted hoax born from a father's grief, a case of collective delusion among traumatized children, or something beyond our understanding? A moment when the boundaries between life and death, presence and absence, blurred just enough to be captured on film. I leave that for you to decide. As for me, I've come to believe that the most profound mysteries often exist at the intersection of technology and human emotion. A camera captures light reflected off the physical world, but perhaps in rare moments it can capture something more. The imprint of love, of guilt, of longing that transcends the physical. 5 children smiled for a photograph in the summer of 1934. 4 were physically present when the shutter clicked, but in the resulting image, 5 faces look back at us across the decades, a memento of friendship, loss, and the enduring question of what remains when we're gone. This has been Daniel Harmon for Shadow Frames, bringing to light the stories that exist in the shadows of history. Thank you for listening. In the attic of my grandmother's house, I've found more photographs with curious notes written on their backs. If you're interested in hearing more stories like Jimmy Wallace's, please subscribe to Shadow Frames. Some mysteries are waiting to be discovered, others to be told. Until next time, remember to look closely at old photographs. You never know what or who might be looking back.